Think you know how much house you can afford? The truth is, it's not just how much the bank approves you for. Guys, welcome back to another episode of Closing the Deal. I am your host, Sam Enright, and sitting across from me is my co-host, Zach Dickson. Zach, what is going on today? How are you, man?
Oh, cannot complain at all. Another day, another week, another episode recording. So cannot complain at all. Beautiful morning here. How about you? How's it going for you this morning?
It's been a good morning so far. So excited to be back recording another. I echo your sentiment, I should say. Excited to be back recording another episode, and I think we got another good one for you guys here. This is something that a lot of first-time home buyers obviously want to know, and maybe even if you're not a first-time home buyer, but this kind of goes hand in hand with our episode that we posted last week, just about 2025 market and whether you should buy or sell. Now we're going to talk about how much, can you really afford and how to, kind of determine that number for yourself.
Yeah, I think it's a pertinent question. Obviously, that's number one, first and foremost. That's in the mind of the buyers. I think that it's also a formula that can be figured out, but it isn't always easily accessible or common knowledge per se. So, having a conversation with a lender at that point is always going to be your best bet. But hopefully we can break it down a little bit in this episode, so can provide some knowledge and value to the listeners and to some of the first time home buyers out there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, guys, just kind of starting off with, just a little bit of I guess a client story. We've had a couple of clients this year that we worked with, and one's jumping out in particular. They were, when they had came to us or came to me, their big question was, how much can I afford? What does this look like? We're looking in this range. We want to bump it up to this range, and I just had to have that conversation with them of just, hey, look, on paper, you guys can afford a lot more than you guys are currently looking at. Let's just be honest. I said, if we're looking at it from your income, we're looking at what you guys have in debts, you guys are going to be close to $450,000 that you guys could potentially afford on paper. And, from a bank perspective, and obviously after having that conversation with them, they're like, whoa, that's obviously not going to be what we're going to do. We're not comfortable with that payment. And so, we can kind of get into that. But I always tell the clients, when we first start working with them, there's a difference between, the bank number and your real number. And, that's kind of trying to give you guys a little bit of perspective on how to break that down, how to decipher it, how we look at it as a lender. Because in some cases, there's another client that we're working with right now that we're trying to stretch the budget, and we can kind of talk about why. For some clients, it may be more feasible to stretch it as max as you can on paper. And for other clients, it may not be. And so that's just, that's kind of where we're going to go with things. So that kind of leads us obviously into the first thing here, the bank number versus the real number, and so when we look at how a bank is going to qualify you for a mortgage, we've talked about it in other episodes, but it's going to be debt to income ratio, income, credit. Those are the sort of things that they're going to look at. And so, when we take a big look at your guys' financial picture, the only thing that we are going to be looking at, I guess not the only thing, but the main things we're going to be looking at is going to be, what is your gross monthly income? So this is a pre-tax number, so whatever it is, let's say you make $25 an hour, time, 40 hours a week, you take that, times that by 52 weeks, divided by 12, and that would be the gross monthly income that we would use to qualify you on paper. Obviously, and I know that there are taxes coming out of that. If you have any sort of insurances, any sort of deductions that your employer is taking out, that actual bring home number is going to be much different than what that gross income number is. However, that's what we're focused on as a lender. We're going to use gross. And we're also going to do a credit pull, and anything that comes back on that credit pull is what we're going to use for your debt to income. So things such as car loans, such as personal loans, any sort of installment debt that you have on credit, as well as revolving credit, those sort of things, credit cards. Trying to think of some other things that could be potentially on credit outside of those. Obviously your mortgages, your HELOCs, if you own a current home, those things are going to show up. and that's what we're going to look at. But you guys know that there is a real number out there that's a little bit different, right? Because we're not taking into account your guys' month-to-month bills as it pertains to, insurances such as car insurance. If you have any sort of, I guess, any sort of motorcycle, any sort of boat, anything that you guys own, there's insurances that you're paying for that. There's phone bills. There are utilities on the property. There's a plethora of different things. If you guys have gym memberships, if you guys have, your streaming services, these are all things that are factoring into your month-to-month budget, right? These are things that are going out that we, the lender, are not looking at. So there's a bank number and a real number, because obviously we're only going to look at a certain aspect of your total monthly budget. And so that's why I always start with clients and say, hey, well, what is it that you would like to be? Where is it that, have you sat down and looked at your own numbers and said, I'm not going above this, on my payment. And obviously that's going to be far more important in my mind than what we can do on paper for you, right? Because you only know your true budget numbers. So, Zach, kind of talk to me, because obviously, you're very familiar with this. Bank number, real number. Are you familiar? Obviously you recently bought a house. So, what was your situation like with the bank number versus the real number?
Well, it was significantly different, as we talked about. I think the first thing when you hear that kind of bank number is you kind of get a little excited, like, oh, can I up my budget a little bit? Can I start looking at some different properties? But then at that point, it's pretty quickly, you have the conversation of what does the monthly payment look like with this bank number? And ultimately, like you touched on in the first segment there, it's significantly different and usually is very, very unattainable in conjunction with the other things that you have going on in your life. I think the general public, most people out there do have other bills, other obligations each month past just your debts that you have, whether that's loans of any sort. So I think the first feeling that you get is a little bit of excitement when you see the bank number, but then you got to kind of bring yourself back down a little bit and just realize what is going to make us or what is going to put us into the best situation possible financially to, get this loan paid off, get this house paid off, and eventually, own it free and clear. And obviously, taking on a monthly mortgage payment that is way over your budget is not going to be advantageous to getting that loan paid off correctly. And so I would say, you got to make sure that you're paying attention to the underlying factors that go into all of your entire monthly financial budget, the financial picture. Just kind of gauging all of those things prior to getting started, so you can have a feel of what your actual monthly mortgage payment budget would be, and then you can kind of work backwards to find that purchase price number at that point. But I think the biggest thing that I would recommend is to not feel house poor. You don't want to purchase a home, purchase a property, and feel like 50, 60, 70% of your income is going to just paying off this house, and so you're not able to make the other obligations that you have each month. And so I would say the trap that most buyers fall into is that they're thinking about their mortgage only. The mortgage is just the beginning as a whole. Taxes, insurance, maintenance, HOA fees, all the things that we talked about in segment 1 are going to go into that payment there. Before you know it, your $2,000 payment is now $2,800, and that is exactly how people end up house poor, all in all.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Just because the bank says you can afford a $500,000 house doesn't mean you should. Obviously you have to look at what the real numbers are versus what the bank numbers are. And, we can show you, what that would look like for you.
And ultimately too, there's another part of this that goes into not just necessarily your obligations that you have month to month, but your lifestyle as well. The choices that you make on on the fun side of things. Whether you're going out on the weekends and spending money on hobbies, activities, or going to concerts or going to festivals or taking, trips, vacations. All of those things are things that you have to consider when you go to purchase this home, this property. Usually the biggest financial purchase that you make in your lifetime. So I would say not just the obligations, but also, the wants that you have as well. We've talked about wants versus needs in the property when you're out searching. But wants versus needs as a whole in life can make a huge difference when you're out there house searching and determining that budget as a whole. So
Yeah, certainly. I mean, that's one of the biggest things. Obviously, it because we've talked about it, it is a huge emotional experience as much as it is, a financial one. When you're going out and buying a house, there's the excitement level. There's, a lot of different things that go into it. But there's, oftentimes, I don't know about you guys, but when I come into things in life, I get, and we get excited about them. We kind of put our blinders on, right? And so we become so tunnel vision or so focused on this one thing that we start to, maybe toss to the side some of the other things that are important, and that's one of them. Those are probably things that fall by the wayside when thinking about buying a house. You're not thinking about a vacation. You're not thinking about, what your lifestyle looks like. Do you go out, to dinner once a week on Saturday, with your kids or with your spouse, and, or, anyone, and go have a good time with your boys or whatever, that those are expenses. Are you into sports that cost money? Do you play golf once a week? Do you play it multiple times a week? There's all these things that, add up. And I think just personally, like, I don't know that would come to center of my mind when purchasing a house either. You know what I mean? And so, it's definitely something to take a step back and think about, because, that's one of the biggest things. Nobody wants to be house poor. It's great to have a house, but if that's the only thing that you can afford to pay month in and month out is your house payment, I feel like you're going to quickly grow resentful of that. You know what I mean? And so that's not something that you want to, it's not a situation you want to subject yourself to. So if we can avoid that, that's why I always, urge a little bit of caution with people. Like when, we do have clients that come to us that are hot and heavy. I want to buy this. I have this house right here, right now. We start looking at it, and when your ratios are maxed and there's really not a lot of room on the back end, those are conversations we probably need to have. Is just like, hey, just because we can doesn't mean that we should. Is this something that you have really given a whole bunch of thought about? And I know that probably sounds counterintuitive, right? As a lender, we should just be, throwing loans at anybody who wants them. But at the end of the day, that's not necessarily, I guess, the philosophy that I would employ. I think it's really important to, take a step back and look at the bigger picture. We don't want to put people in bad positions, because there's a different side of it that we've talked about a little bit, but there's a back end of every loan that people don't see and that people don't often think about. Realtors, even most lenders, don't think about is, what happens if that client cannot make that payment? That obviously ultimately reflects back on you at some point down the line, depending on when that is. This is a business where we are audited, we're looked at, and so if we are issuing bad loans where people cannot repay them because we're just as eager and just as ready to get somebody into a house, that sort of thing, without kind of looking at all the factors, that could potentially come back to hurt us a little bit as well. So it's definitely, across the board smart to kind of take a step back and look at the whole picture.
for sure, because I think, going back to your resentful point, honestly, I think that's a legitimate thing. And when you don't think about, those hidden costs or those wants throughout the process, and then you end up house poor, you buy the property and now you can only afford the house. You don't necessarily realize those things until really after the fact. When your friend texts you that they're going on vacation, ask you if you want to join, you can't join because your house, you got to make your house payment, or whether they ask you to go out on a Saturday night and you can't do that because you have your house payment. And so I would say that the resentfulness, that doesn't really present itself until after the fact, after you make this decision kind of set in stone. There's no real going back to it. So I would just highlight again the importantness of determining these numbers prior to making this purchase, because again, it is a large one. Can't really go back on it. You can put it right back on the market if you'd like, but best of luck to you on that front. So
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I don't know how many people are having luck with buying a house and then turning around and selling it,
yeah,
that quickly. So it's definitely not something that we see, in And again, it's really just about trying to separate that emotional side and that practical side of you, and trying to meet in the middle. I'm not saying, we're not saying that you shouldn't be excited about the process, that you shouldn't be excited about buying a home, but don't let those emotions cloud your judgment, and put you in a bad position. And so ultimately on, the lender and everybody as well, I know that's not a fun conversation to have. And it's not, something that, we're not going to necessarily tell our clients like, no, you cannot buy this house. That's not what we're saying. But, just trying to maybe even urge those, those thoughts a little bit, and just say, hey, this is where we're at, just want to make sure that this, does this make sense? This is the payment for you, that sort of thing. And really kind of looking at that. And ultimately, that's your decision to make at the end of the day. If that's something you want to do and you can do it on paper, then absolutely, go ahead. Can't obviously stop you from doing that. So, but kind of getting into the next side of things here for you guys, wanted to give you a little bit of an idea of where, if you wanted to figure out, how much can I afford? So I'm going to tell you that these numbers are based on, by loan guideline standards. These are very, very conservative debt to income ratios. We're going to talk about the 28-36 rule. This is probably, again, this is going to help with that real world, application more than it is on paper, the 28-36, because on paper, most loan guidelines, like conventional, if you have high enough credit scores, if you have good reserves, you can stretch your debt, your back end debt ratio to 49%. And we're obviously stopping at, 36. For FHA, if you have good compensating factors, you can stretch that back end debt ratio to 56%. So, obviously on paper, again, we could get more aggressive here than this 28-36, but I think this is a helpful built-in buffer to understand, like, hey, if we go off of these numbers, this is going to leave room for the things that we're talking about, the vacations, the utilities, the monthly obligations that are not being looked at by the lender, that make up maybe that other 10%, you know what I mean, that we could stretch it. So, just getting into, a couple examples here. Obviously, I pulled some numbers for you guys, whichever applies to you. I pulled household income for someone for $50,000 a year earners, for $100,000 a year earners, and then also $150,000. So that's household income again. So if you have two people earning income, and you find yourself, or if you're just one person earning income and you find yourself into this income bracket, these would be kind of the numbers for you. So at $50,000 a year, that gross monthly income would be $4,166. So you get that just by dividing 50,000 divided by 12. 28% of that would be $1,166 a month. So again, a front end debt ratio is your income, or is your proposed payment divided by, or 28% of your gross monthly income. So we would take $4,166 times 28%, and we would end up with that $1,166. So again, this is just your straight up monthly payment coming out of whatever it is that you make gross monthly. 28% is going to be conservative, but it's going to help build in that buffer. This would include principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. So anytime we quote payments to clients, we are obviously including all of it. This is not just a base principal and interest payment. Now, 36% on the back end, this is including your debt. So you would take, 36% times, your gross monthly income. You would minus out whatever your proposed payment would be, so that 1166, and that would leave you with, total would be about $1,500 a month for 36%. So that's going to leave you about, $334 a month, $334 a month in extra things. So let's say you have $200 in car loans, you have $100 in credit card payments, that's going to leave you with about $1,200 a month left over to make your mortgage payment. So those are just some kind of quick numbers for you to look at. You could potentially, I would focus on the back end first and foremost. So basically whatever it is that you make monthly, divide that, or take that, multiply it by 36%, minus out whatever is on your credit. So if you have a car loan, if you have a credit card payment, take that, minus it out, and that would be a good indication of where you can start off with, again, housing wise. Now, we do need to be a little bit realistic about, where these payments are going to lead you to in a price range. And obviously, Zach, you can talk about that a little bit, just with the difference, obviously, that we've seen in the market. We talked about it last week. What was 2022 is not what is 2025, and so, and I don't know, again, that we're going to see that change. So we do need to be a little bit realistic about what that looks like moving forward as well.
For sure. And honestly, it is a very dependent number on a few different variables. Obviously, depending on the amount that you're bringing down, that's going to change your monthly payment. The amount of the interest rate, whether that's, like we talked about last week, whether it's, 5.5 in 2022 or 6.5 here in 2025, that's going to make a little bit of difference as well on the monthly payment side. And then obviously your taxes, property taxes will vary greatly between communities. It just as an example, Granville taxes and Newark taxes are completely different, but they do, but like the borders of each city come together. So literally, if you're one street over, that could be almost $500 per month in difference in taxes, solely because you're in a different township or a different city than what the other street over is. So, and then home insurance obviously is going to be the last kind of variable in that monthly payment. And so when you're thinking about $1,200 per monthly mortgage payment, which includes insurance, taxes, principal, and interest. Generally speaking, that's going to find you a house in around the 150 to 200 range. And so that is still obtainable in our market here in Central Ohio. Can definitely find some properties in that price range. But obviously, again, just depends on the area and condition and all of those different kind of variables there.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's one of those things where, you just got to be a little bit more realistic. I mean, we've had some clients that are out looking in that price range currently, but it definitely, I think, has moved more outside of the major cities, the metropolitan areas. I mean, you got to be a little bit more rural if you're going to find that, especially, I mean, of quality, right? I mean, you can probably find that sort of property inside those areas, but it's going to be a little bit rough around the edges. It's likely going to need some work, going to need some money put into it. So it's not exactly just this, maybe not even just exactly move-in ready type of property. We have a lot of people that
Yeah.
come to us and asking us for, can they get financing on these types of homes, that are 120,000, and you look at it and it's like gutted on the inside, and it obviously needs some money and needs some work. And so, there's obviously limits to what the loan programs are willing to lend on as well when it comes to traditional financing. The property has to be move-in ready. You can't just, buy something that has no insides to it with a regular conventional loan. That's just not something that they are willing to lend on. So something to think about there as well. Now, taking you guys into example two, which would be $100,000, gross month or gross yearly income as a household. So that's going to end up being roughly around $8,333 a month. I apologize. And so using our same rule of thumb here, taking 28% for a front end debt ratio, that's going to be $2,333 a month, in a proposed monthly mortgage payment. And then also the total back end debt ratio of 36% would leave us with, $3,000 a month. So realistically, you're looking at about, a total of like $650 in monthly liabilities, to kind of stay within that range of being, kind of in that safe spot. Again, guys, these are based on numbers where we're building in a little bit of buffer for your actual real life, financial things that are going on outside of the loan. These are just, things that we're looking at from a credit perspective. So about $650 a month in credit liabilities, things such as auto loans, credit card payments, student loan bills, anything of the sort. Now, again, this is going to definitely bump you up, for a home in a different price range. I mean, I would say if you're looking at $2,300 a month in this market, you're going to be able to kind of move into some of those different, maybe those more metropolitan areas, definitely going to be able to keep up with a little bit more of what's going on, with the raise in the raise in housing cost, I think this is likely going to have you closer to like a $280,000 to $350,000 range, just depending on, again, your situation. Obviously, if you're buying in New Albany and your New Albany taxes are $800 a month, that's going to drastically be different than if you're buying in Newark and your taxes are $200 a month. So obviously, that's going to take, what you're purchasing and drastically limit you in New Albany, right? You're going to be able to afford less house there because of the other factors that are going into it. Whereas if you buy in a lower tax area, you're going to be able to stretch that budget a little bit more. So the numbers are not perfect. They don't work out to be this perfect math of like, okay, this is exactly what you afford. But again, it gives you an idea of that kind of range that you're going to be in, at that, if you're earning, $100,000, um, in gross monthly or gross yearly income as a household.
For sure, for sure. So finishing up on our examples, we're just going to bump it up just one more $50,000 rung up to the $150,000 household gross annual income. So that would give us about $12,500 in gross monthly income. And the 28% at that number is going to be $3,500 per month. And then the 36% at that number is going to be the $4,500 per month. So that would leave you about $1,200 in other liabilities, whether that's, cars, student loans, et cetera, et cetera. And so all in all, again, like we talked about, just a little bit of variables here, but you could probably get a home for that monthly mortgage price, somewhere in the $500,000, $600,000 range. So we'll definitely be able to keep up with, like you just mentioned, what's going on in the community, in the area, and pretty much I think we'll have a pick of the litter in terms of locations and whatnot if you're in that price range there. And so.
Yeah, for sure. And I think obviously some people, not everybody has very, very low monthly liabilities. We see some clients that have nothing on their credit, and then we have other clients that have a whole bunch of things on their credit. So obviously those factors are going to impact you as well. If your debt to income ratio is much higher, then you probably need to be a little bit more realistic about, kind of the range that you're looking in, in order to build in those buffers. So, kind of taking it into, real stories or, clients that we've actually worked with that have gone through this process that we've talked with. Obviously I kind of started it off by talking about a client, some people that we worked with earlier this year. And, the number was drastically different from what they've actually purchased versus what they were qualified for on paper. Together, they were in that, in that rough $100,000 a year in, gross annual income as a household. And so when we started looking at the numbers and looked at the area that they were looking to purchase in, on paper, they had very, very low monthly liabilities. And so, I had let them know, they're like, we're a little concerned. First, they were looking in an area of like 220, right? 230. And so they came to me, they're like, hey, we want to bump our budget up, $30,000, $40,000. We're a little concerned that we're not going to be able to get there. And I was like, guys, like you guys could get like $200,000 more on paper if you really wanted to. Like, so obviously there's a huge difference there in between what they were comfortable with versus what we could actually get on paper. On paper, we were somewhere around $450,000. And, in their minds and their budget, they're not wanting to push over, 300,000. And so they obviously ended up landing somewhere kind of, in that middle ground. But that's obviously just a good testament to not getting overly involved in what we can do on paper and sticking more to, okay, what is our lifestyle? What it makes the most sense for our lifestyle, right? And so for them, they were very honest about those things and looked over everything, amongst them and decided that that's not, where they ultimately wanted to go. They didn't want to go that high. And so, they ended up landing in a good spot for them. And now they're able to, do the things that they want to do and still make their house payment and enjoy a nice house and not have to worry about, being stretched too thin.
For sure. And I think that I'm sitting here trying to think, and I don't think I have a good example of the flip side, thankfully. I don't think I have a good example of a client that, bought entirely too high and has texted me stressed out about feeling house poor, how they're going to make their mortgage payment. So that's a good thing, I think. Do you have anybody on that side of things?
I don't have necessarily anybody on that side, but I did want to talk about, maybe a different example that kind of goes into stretching. So, what we've seen in clients that we have worked with. So we actually have a client right now, the husband, great credit score, very, very low monthly liabilities. And unfortunately, the wife has had a little bit more issues with credit, lower credit score. She has most of the liabilities on her credit. They both make great income. Um, but unfortunately, due to those purposes, we adding her to the loan doesn't necessarily make sense. And so for him, we can stretch his budget a lot further. And so we're pushing those ratios to almost the maximum amount that we can. But in my mind, there's a little bit more of a comfortability level there because we obviously know that the wife has an income that is not being used on the application. So there is another, basically double or not double, but exactly the same amount of income that we're using on the application on the other side that's not being looked into. And so if you are in one of those situations, I would not shy away from telling them, hey, we can definitely push your budget here. You guys clearly have a whole other income that's not being considered into this. And so when you look at the monthly mortgage payment, yes, on paper for you specifically, is it a lot? 100%. But when you take in your wife's, income who's not on the loan application, now all of a sudden the ratios are very, very low and we're not really, we're not stressed at all, at that point. And so those are some situations that we do run into that we, sometimes get a little bit creative for the clients. This client in particular, they have, a couple of kids. And so obviously they need a bigger house. They need something that's going to be able to fit all of that. And so in their case, they are trying to stretch it as far as they can on the single income because obviously they know they have the joint income on the back end. And so, they obviously want to get there and so that they can get the house that they're looking for. They're looking for multiple bedrooms with land and that sort of thing. And so that would be another example. I mean, we don't have too many clients that, that have stretched too far or stretched too thin, none that obviously report back to us and tell us that. I'm sure that we have in our time span of closing loans, I'm sure we have had some clients that have closed and have gotten themselves in a position where maybe they are stretched a little bit too thin. But, for the most part, again, we try to take care of our clients the best we can. And obviously the loan programs have built-in things for that. So, I mean, if you don't have a highly compensating factors, it's very hard for us to stretch somebody past a really reasonable budget anyways. You know what I mean? So if you don't have, a high credit score, if you don't have money sitting in a bank, it is going to be a little bit hard if you have none of that, not a good credit score, no money, no assets, and you're trying to stretch to these high percentages that are going to put you in a bad position. It's very hard for the loan guidelines or the loan to approve itself anyways. You know what I mean? So there is kind of that built-in buffer on our end to make sure that we're not putting clients in that situation.
For sure, and that's a great example, honestly, because I think it takes us back to a point that we've hit on a lot here in our podcast content in general, is that the conversation with the lender should be first and foremost. Don't necessarily commit one way or the other, whether it's, oh, I can 100% afford this, or vice versa. I cannot afford this at all. Have that conversation with a lender first and foremost, and try to figure that out together. Don't make that rash decision by yourself with no information, with no, extra, all the information that a lender has you don't have as a buyer. So again, just have that conversation up front and to begin with, and so expectations can be clearly set at that point, and then you can move forward with the home search, free and clear. I think that too many people will kind of disqualify themselves, and too many people pre-qualify themselves. And I think that it just goes back to something we've talked about a lot, is have that conversation with the lender first and foremost, get pre-approved. So
Yeah, for sure. I think that's, again, that's the most important thing because there's so many different things that go into it. Sometimes it even blows my mind how much goes into these loans on this side of things. And so everybody's situation is different. And, just because, you may think that it's a certain way, I'm sure that client, when they applied, thought that because they both made great income, that it was going to make sense for both of them to go on the loan and they would be able to get to this, price range that they're looking for. And the reality of the situation is not always that. There's things, how many times we talk to people that don't even know, things that are on their credit, or don't even know how low their credit is comparative to where they think it is, or just all these things. And so to make all of these plans based on information that you don't fully have, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. So getting, linked up with a professional, getting linked up with somebody who can help kind of explain and decipher those things, and also maybe prompt the right questions for you as well. Ask the proper things that get you thinking about the situations, that we've talked about. What about your lifestyle? What about, all these things that you want to do? Do you want to go to work week over week and break your back to only be able to make your mortgage payment? Most people would answer no to that. And so, we got to have those conversations about, what's realistic. Just because something, you find something online and it looks great and dandy, doesn't mean that, when you hear that payment number come out, doesn't mean that that's going to be something that makes you move, towards that, in that direction. You know what I mean? So.
Couldn't agree more, brother. Couldn't agree more. I think just one last thing I wanted to touch on, kind of going back to the lifestyle and hidden costs segment as a whole, is one thing we did not touch on is unexpected expenses. We talked about the wants, the needs, the things, the obligations that we want, but we didn't really touch on things that we don't expect coming. So again, if you are in a situation where you're putting yourself into a house poor situation where you can only make your monthly mortgage payment, and then you have a month where the car breaks down or you get injured and you can't work, you're not going to be able to pay for those things likely, or in the interim be able to save enough money to have that buffer period to be able to take care of some of those unexpected expenses. And so I think that's just one more thing that we didn't really touch on and got to think about when you're thinking about the budget as a whole. Because again, they're unexpected for a reason. They pop up when you least expect it, when you least need it, in the most inopportune times as a whole. So definitely something to think about.
Yeah, and I think that obviously leads to the point of, not only not stretching the budget as far as you can, but also not, taking the savings that you've saved up and draining it on just the down payment or just the cost, to get the house in general. I would never recommend that either. I would always recommend leaving yourself at least a little bit of a buffer in there, even if it's just a couple thousand, even if it's 2 to 3 months worth of your mortgage payment set back, just in case. Again, like Zach said, they are unexpected for a reason. Nobody, gets in their car and drives to work and expects to, either, be in an accident and your car's totaled and now you have to go get a new one, or, your tires pop, or you got to go get new things, or something breaks down in your car and you got to pay, $1,000, $1,500 to get it repaired, whatever the case may be. We don't wake up. I would hope most of us don't wake up with that mindset of something's going to go wrong today. We all do know that those things happen, but, it's just about being prepared for those. And that's something that I've personally taken extremely seriously in my own life over the last couple of years. And that, building my own personal, in-house buffer for, for those things, because ultimately the older I get, the more I realize that, these things are uncontrollable. They are unexpected, and getting caught, almost with like your hand in the cookie jar and not being prepared is never a good position. It just adds unneeded stress, when you could, obviously, I guess, alleviate that the most that you can. I don't think you're going to go into an unexpected situation and not feel any stress, but you're going to feel a lot better if you've taken care of things on the back end and built in for those. Be prepared for those sort of situations. So that's another thing to think about as well, is when you guys are saving for down payments, and those sort of things, like, make sure that we're not just focusing on the end goal of, hey, this is all this money is going to go towards that. Like, hey, let's save some extra, let's build in some additional buffer amount, that way we don't have to drain everything to get the end goal.
Couldn't agree more, brother. Could not agree more. So wrapping up, pretty good episode as a whole. I think we touched on a lot of different key points and, kind of answered the question as a whole: how much can I really afford? And obviously, for a buyer's perspective, with the information that we provided in the episode, it's going to be pretty surface level. Obviously, again, still want to have that conversation with a lender to begin the process. But obviously, you can take your numbers that you have, with the ratios that we provided and kind of get a ballpark estimate as to, how much can you really afford, and kind of get you started before you have that conversation as a whole. So, talking about the bank versus real affordability, our hidden costs and unexpected expenses, and then, our 28-36 rule were kind of some of the highlights and main points of our episode today.
Yeah, for sure. Obviously this is all just general information to kind of help you guys, but don't let it discourage you or keep you from looking into buying a house if that's something that you're interested in. Again, every situation is different. All of these scenarios that we listed are a little black and white, right? Like we're just kind of just listing out numbers. That's not the real world. That's not how it works. Not everybody's situation again is black and white. There is room in the middle for gray area, and everybody is different. And so, that's ultimately the job of us, the lender. That's ultimately, our goal. Our job is to help guide you through that and help make sense of everything, and to explore all options on your behalf and see what the best route is going to be. And I don't think there's anything wrong with, we've had quite a few clients over the last couple of months reach out and know that they're not ready at this moment to purchase a house, but that they want to in the next year. And, it's one of those things where oftentimes in life, we prepare for a lot of things, right? When we know that we're going to do something, we take the steps, or we do the studying, or we don't just go jump straight into it, right? And so, why would this be any different? In my opinion, reach out to a lender. Most lenders are going to do free consultations, are going to speak with you, are going to go over everything with you with, no strings attached. At that point, it's not like you have to pay to sit down, and have that conversation about, hey, well, what does this look like for me? That's something that, we can definitely do, and help kind of guide you if you're looking in the next 12 months or the next 18 months. How do you build a game plan around that, whether it's credit issues, whether it's income related stuff, whether it's budget related items or saving. What does this game plan, what does this path look like? There's never any problem with reaching out to a professional and having those conversations, in my mind, and getting a game plan put together. So I would definitely, encourage all of you to reach out, either to myself or to another lender that you guys know, and kind of work on that, that affordability plan, and what that path forward looks like for you.
Could not have said it better myself, brother. Could not have said it better myself. So I think that will pretty much wrap us up here. Hopefully you guys, again, found some value, found some interesting nuggets in here in this episode, and took something away from it. And we will see you guys on the next one.
Absolutely. See you guys later.